It was a Saturday evening, just another. The kind of evening when the air is cool and the sky paints itself orange and pink. I was alone in the kitchen at home, sipping my coffee, watching the last rays of the sun dip behind the trees. My husband Mark was working the night shift. He was a paramedic, always on call. The house was quiet, apart from the floorboards groaning from time to time, a gentle reminder that our son Jack was there, working on his master's. He was 24, and even though he'd been living with us for a few years now, it felt like we never really spent time with each other anymore. He had his own routine, his own existence. Something was different that day, though. It was an odd sense of unease, something I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the wind pounding on the windows, or maybe it was because I hadn't laid eyes on Jack in hours. Usually, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. He was a grown man, after all, capable of taking care of himself. But then I heard it, a sound, just a light knock, like the sound of typing on a keyboard. I had to tell myself to ignore it. He must be working on a project or doing something on schoolwork. But something stayed my hand. Maybe it was my intuition. Maybe I just questioned. I put my coffee down and went to go see how he was doing. The creaky old wooden stairs groaned under my feet as I climbed the stairs, and for an instant I was tempted to turn back. But I didn't. His door was slightly ajar, the soft glow of his computer screen lighting up the hallway. My heart was racing. I froze for a fraction of a second, poised to knock, but then I was transfixed. The scene in front of me caused me to come to a stop. Jack sat on his bed, fingers dashing across the keyboard. At first, I thought he was just watching something. A film, maybe? But then I spotted the details that I couldn't help but notice. My stomach twisted. He wasn't just watching a movie. It was something else, something I wasn't prepared for. He looked up, his face turning white, his fingers stumbling to shut the screen, but too late. When our eyes met, I knew. I couldn't move my eyes away. Neither of us moved. The space between us was thick with things left unsaid, with embarrassment. Jack apologized, stuttering, his voice small, barely audible. I had no idea what to do. I could not move, and in an instant, everything that I had known about our relationship was altered. I spun around and exited his room without speaking. My heart pounded in my chest, and my head reeled, attempting to make sense of what I had just seen. I should have knocked, I thought. I shouldn't have entered. But I had, and now nothing would ever be the same. The following days were a haze. Everything appeared the same on the surface. Jack kept on devoting his mornings to drowning in books, and I carried on as usual, cooking dinner and cleaning the house. But below that flimsy veneer of normalcy, things weren't the same anymore. The tension between us was more substantial now, palpable. Each glance I saw from him was shot through with something I couldn't quite describe. Shame, guilt, or maybe both. But there was something else too. A silence not uttered. A crack in the hard foundation of our once happy home. Jack started to avoid my gaze, making sure never to have his and mine cross, except when he absolutely couldn't help it. When we did talk, our conversations were staccato, tense, as if we were both trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But I knew. He knew. We both knew that whatever there had been between us before no longer was. One afternoon, as I was standing at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables for dinner, I could feel him behind me. He wasn't doing anything noisy or trying to start a conversation, just standing there, near enough that I could feel the heat of his body. It made its way under my skin. There was something else to it than that, too. I could feel the way his body would contract slightly, as if caught between wanting to be near me and something else. There was an unsettling period of a couple of seconds' silence before I walked round to the cupboard to fetch something. It wasn't much, just a small brush of fingers. My hand swept across his as I reached for the dish, but it was electric, like the charge in the air that can't be present. I froze. He froze. For a moment, neither of us breathed, our gazes colliding for a moment before I quickly looked away, my heart thumping in my chest. The tension was between us like a dense fog, something I couldn't help but notice no matter how much I wished I could ignore it. I attempted to reassure myself it was nothing, merely an accident, a coincidence. But I knew, deep within myself, it was the beginning of something I couldn't stop. Something we both knew we shouldn't try, but something that felt too real to pretend didn't exist. The remaining days following that strange incident in the kitchen passed by like a blur. I kept myself busy with tidying up, venturing out on chores, anything just to prevent myself from being alone with myself. The tension between Jack and me, however, grew only thicker, more stifling. Whenever I walked into a room, he would stiffen, like bracing himself for something he had no control over. He no longer greeted me with chat. He just sat in the same room as me, both of us acting as if the other were not there. It was on one of those nights, when Mark was working, that things began to change. I sat in the living room, aimlessly going through a magazine, when Jack came out. He said nothing, simply stood in the doorway staring at me. His face was expressionless, yet somehow I could feel something there, something changing. When I glanced up, our eyes locked. Time stood still for a moment. His eyes were not the same, soft and distant as they used to be, but fierce, focused, as if he was searching for something in me. I sensed the power of his stare, as if he was holding his breath for me to do or say something. I swallowed hard, my throat closing, but I couldn't seem to speak. The words jammed. Then, out of nowhere, Jack edged closer. Not close, but close enough to fill the gap that had always existed between us. It was unobtrusive, almost imperceptible, but the shift in his attitude was unmistakable. I felt the heat of his body slightly too close, his breathing now on me. My heart began pounding, and the familiar flutter of fear crept up my spine. I must leave, I must flee, but I was immobile. I was frozen. And then it happened. He touched me, a gentle touch, a stroke of his fingers on my arm. It wasn't menacing, but it was a crossing of a line I had never imagined. The world contracted around me. I needed to pull back, to yell, to put an end to this before it spiraled out of control. But I remained immobile. For the first time in days, my body didn't obey the alarm bells in my mind. I attempted to shove him back, let him know this was wrong. But something else kept me from doing it. A feeling, a pull I could not shake. And then, before I even realized what was happening, the room fell too silent, and the distance between us just vanished. It happened so fast I could not stop it. One instant we were there, and then the next, Jack leaned in. I could feel the weight of his body, the heat of his flesh, so close that I heard him breathing. It wasn't as before. This was no accidental brush of skin. There was purpose now, a soft, knowing touch between us that could not be ignored. My heart pounded in my chest as his hand reached out, hesitantly touched my arm, shivering me through. I ought to have retreated, but I didn't move. His dark, focused eyes held mine while he moved closer. I could smell the faint scent of his aftershave, the warmth of his body overpowering everything else. I wasn't thinking. I couldn't think. His lips were on mine, at first soft and tentative. But then, as if something inside both of us cracked, it intensified. I watched the room spin. Everything in me was yelling at me to halt, to push him away, but my body had other ideas. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with something else, something that didn't compute, something that was too wrong and too right at the same time. As we finally left, I was barely able to breathe. His expression had changed. It no longer wore the look of self-consciousness of the past days. There was, instead, quiet confidence, an air of mutual understanding that we could not avoid. And there was also something else, a chilling sense of realization that all had changed. The walls between us had collapsed in that moment. Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. He knew it too. We both knew there was no going back. And yet, in the silence, the weight of what had just happened was impossible to avoid. I should have left, should have ended it then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, heart racing, trying to find sense in the madness inside me. I woke the next morning with a leaden feeling in my chest, as though something heavy had been laid on me overnight. The tension between me and Jack was still alive, heavy and unspoken. I couldn't help but relive it constantly in my mind, and yet at the same time be terrified of what it meant. I had vowed to myself that I would never allow things to get so out of control, but now it appeared as if the boundaries between us had shifted, maybe forever. The subsequent days were strangely mundane. Mark was still consumed by work, and Jack and I continued our routine. But now, there was this unspoken tension that we couldn't help but sense. I would catch Jack looking at me from across the room, his eyes running over mine like he was waiting for something. It was so subtle, but it was there. And I could sense it, too. Whenever I walked by him, I could sense my heart thudding, the air between us thick with something I didn't understand. One evening, when the sun had set below the horizon and colored the house orange, I sat alone in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book. But quiet had never been so deafening. Then Jack appeared. He stood for a minute at the doorway, then took a seat across from me in quiet. We didn't speak, a word was unnecessary. We both understood what had happened, though we weren't yet ready to talk about it. I finally raised my head from the book, looking at him. His face was calm, but there was something different in his eyes, a quiet that meant he understood. He didn't want more. He didn't push me to say anything. It was as if we both knew that the conversation we were avoiding was something more than either of us could deal with right then. We could have avoided it, could have kept on pretending that everything was fine, but somehow the unspoken truth hung between us like an unspoken promise. I stood up, needing some space to breathe. I think I need some time. I breathed softly, my voice barely audible. Jack nodded slowly, not in agreement, but silently comprehending. I get it, he said in a low, even tone. Take your time. The heavy quiet that had hovered between us was starting to realign. For an instant, there was serenity. Not the peace of everything being all right, but the peace that erupts when two individuals know things will never remain the same, but are still attempting to work with it. And then, as I prepared to leave the room, I turned to find Jack still staring at me. No tension now, no confusion. Only peace. I'll be fine, I whispered to myself more than him. As I left the room, I came to something. A realization, at least. This was far from over, yet somehow I felt a sense of relief. The storm did not pass, but I had weathered it, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough for the time being. This is an artistic and fictional creation intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. Some scenes and dialogues in the video are part of a dramatized performance and incorporate elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator stands against discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel fully complies with YouTube's policies and does not infringe upon copyright laws.
Why?